英語学習に重要なのは、品質のフレーズを丸暗記することです。それにより、本当に重要な単語にだけ集中できます。この動画は、基礎練トレーニング。
He was fired. In other words, he lost his job. He was fired. In other words, he lost his job.
He was fired. In other words, he lost his job.
The store is open 24/7. In other words, it never closes. The store is open 24/7. In other words, it never closes.
The store is open 24/7. In other words, it never closes.
We are over budget. In other words, we spent too much money. We are over budget. In other words, we spent too much money.
We are over budget. In other words, we spent too much money.
The meeting was cancelled. In other words, we don't need to go today. The meeting was cancelled. In other words, we don't need to go today.
The meeting was cancelled. In other words, we don't need to go today.
He is the manager. In other words, he is in charge of the team. He is the manager. In other words, he is in charge of the team.
He is the manager. In other words, he is in charge of the team.
The project is due tomorrow. In other words, we must finish it today. The project is due tomorrow. In other words, we must finish it today.
The project is due tomorrow. In other words, we must finish it today.
You need more vitamins. In other words, you should eat more fruit. You need more vitamins. In other words, you should eat more fruit.
You need more vitamins. In other words, you should eat more fruit.
We need to innovate. In other words, we need to create new ideas. We need to innovate. In other words, we need to create new ideas.
We need to innovate. In other words, we need to create new ideas.
The course is free. In other words, you don't have to pay anything. The course is free. In other words, you don't have to pay anything.
The course is free. In other words, you don't have to pay anything.
The app is offline. In other words, it doesn't need an internet connection. The app is offline. In other words, it doesn't need an internet connection.
The app is offline. In other words, it doesn't need an internet connection.
It's freezing outside. In other words, it's very cold. It's freezing outside. In other words, it's very cold.
It's freezing outside. In other words, it's very cold.
The company's profits increased. In other words, it made more money. The company's profits increased. In other words, it made more money.
The company's profits increased. In other words, it made more money.
The flight was nonstop. In other words, it didn't land anywhere else. The flight was nonstop. In other words, it didn't land anywhere else.
The flight was nonstop. In other words, it didn't land anywhere else.
The product is out of stock. In other words, it was very popular. The product is out of stock. In other words, it was very popular.
The product is out of stock. In other words, it was very popular.
The link is broken. In other words, it doesn't work. The link is broken. In other words, it doesn't work.
The link is broken. In other words, it doesn't work.
I'm busy. In other words, I can't come to the party. I'm busy. In other words, I can't come to the party.
I'm busy. In other words, I can't come to the party.
The contract is signed. In other words, the deal is final. The contract is signed. In other words, the deal is final.
The contract is signed. In other words, the deal is final.
This is the best option. In other words, you should choose this one. This is the best option. In other words, you should choose this one.
This is the best option. In other words, you should choose this one.
Technology is evolving. In other words, things will keep changing. Technology is evolving. In other words, things will keep changing.
Technology is evolving. In other words, things will keep changing.
The area is restricted. In other words, you can't enter without permission. The area is restricted. In other words, you can't enter without permission.
The area is restricted. In other words, you can't enter without permission.
We are a team. In other words, we help each other. We are a team. In other words, we help each other.
We are a team. In other words, we help each other.
I reached my target. In other words, I achieved my goal. I reached my target. In other words, I achieved my goal.
I reached my target. In other words, I achieved my goal.
The trip was unforgettable. In other words, I will always remember it. The trip was unforgettable. In other words, I will always remember it.
The trip was unforgettable. In other words, I will always remember it.
He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth. He lied. In other words, he didn't tell
He lied. In other words, he didn't tell the truth.
The result was positive. In other words, we succeeded. The result was positive. In other words, we succeeded.
The result was positive. In other words, we succeeded.
She didn't reply. In other words, she said no. She didn't reply. In other words, she said no.
She didn't reply. In other words, she said no.
He left the company. In other words, he resigned. He left the company. In other words, he resigned.
He left the company. In other words, he resigned.
The event was rescheduled. In other words, it was delayed. The event was rescheduled. In other words, it was delayed.
The event was rescheduled. In other words, it was delayed.
It's free. In other words, you don't have to pay. It's free. In other words, you don't have to pay.
It's free. In other words, you don't have to pay.
The room is full. In other words, there are no more seats. The room is full. In other words, there are no more seats.
The room is full. In other words, there are no more seats.
He got promoted. In other words, he was given more responsibility. He got promoted. In other words, he was given more responsibility.
He got promoted. In other words, he was given more responsibility.
She's going abroad. In other words, she'll be away for a while. She's going abroad. In other words, she'll be away for a while.
She's going abroad. In other words, she'll be away for a while.
The deadline has passed. In other words, it's too late. The deadline has passed. In other words, it's too late.
The deadline has passed. In other words, it's too late.
The price was reduced. In other words, it was on sale. The price was reduced. In other words, it was on sale.
The price was reduced. In other words, it was on sale.
We took the wrong road. In other words, we got lost. We took the wrong road. In other words, we got lost.
We took the wrong road. In other words, we got lost.
Our team scored more points. In other words, we won. Our team scored more points. In other words, we won.
Our team scored more points. In other words, we won.
I didn't bring it. In other words, I forgot it at home. I didn't bring it. In other words, I forgot it at home.
I didn't bring it. In other words, I forgot it at home.
He's not feeling well. In other words, he's sick. He's not feeling well. In other words, he's sick.
He's not feeling well. In other words, he's sick.
She doesn't eat meat or dairy. In other words, she's vegan. She doesn't eat meat or dairy. In other words, she's vegan.
She doesn't eat meat or dairy. In other words, she's vegan.
The company ran out of money. In other words, it went bankrupt. The company ran out of money. In other words, it went bankrupt.
The company ran out of money. In other words, it went bankrupt.
今日もお疲れ様でした。一区切りついたら、温かい一杯を。